So yesterday we covered my favourite Friday the 13th of all time, Jason Lives, an absolute banger of a movie that created a new Jason who felt like he had more in common with the classic Universal monsters than your average slasher. And from his resurrection we got a great big action horror flick with awesome characters, a fantastic hero, a fun sense of humour and a unique personality that emanated from every frame. After such a massive step up in quality, it felt like they really had truly figured out how to make this franchise work. Not just on a fun slasher appealing to teens on a Friday night level, but on a proper, holy shit, is this like a legit good movie level? As the film, for the first time in the franchise history, even won some critical appraisal. So now they're cooking with fire, right? They've totally figured out how to make a fantastic Friday the 13th film. They've got the perfect tone, the perfect Jason, the perfect hero, so long as they don't do anything totally out there like, I don't know, add a telekinetic teenager who battles Jason with psychic powers, we're golden! Oh wait. Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, is unusual. It's not uncommon for this series to veer off into strange departures. We've already by this point had a fake Jason and a zombie Jason brought back by a lightning bolt after all. Not to mention the whole Jason as the series' main villain thing itself was its own strange departure that sort of confusingly hand-waved away a lot of continuity from the first film, retconning or maybe not retconning Jason drowning as a child. I don't know, it's hard to tell what happened there. I'm sure they come up with a more spelled out ridiculous explanation in some book tie-in or graphic novel somewhere, but I don't care. Point is, the series takes some wild swings from time to time. And I actually think in some way, that's kind of its appeal. It keeps the important bits that people care about the same, namely Jason killing people, and then for everything else, it's a free-for-all. Approaching continuity and concept with a kind of free-spirited and reckless abandon, and yet, even with this in mind, Jason being brought back to life by and then subsequently battling a telekinetic teenager was probably not on anyone's Friday the 13th bingo cards for guessing how the next movie would play out. But that is exactly what we got. I guess psychokinetic teenagers are part of the franchise now. Okay, sure, why not? I mean, it's not even like this is the strangest route the series will take in its original 11 film run. Not by a long shot. Still though, this is weird, right? How exactly do you end up here? Well, this film was, like many Friday the 13th films, supposed to be Freddy vs. Jason, which obviously wouldn't materialise as a movie until 2003, a whole 15 years later. Obviously the idea for Freddy vs. Jason was floated around a long time before the movie was made, but I actually think just after 6 might have been the first time the thought sort of propped up in any production conversation. Unfortunately, New Line, who owned Freddy, and Paramount, who owned Jason, couldn't work out a deal where both parties were happy. And realistically, how could they? The idea was, after all, first floated as a way to kind of bring Jason out of his diminishing box office returns, with his previous and best movie making the least amount of money of any of the films so far, with a still pretty profitable and respectable box office of 19.4 million on a budget of 3 million. However, Freddy was making over double that the same year, turning out nearly 50 million with Nightmare on Elm Street 4 on a budget of only 6.5 mil. So naturally, that's a pretty difficult conversation if you're coming from Paramount to strike a deal. At this point, Freddy is riding high, whereas Jason is seemingly starting to lose his luster to audiences. Jason needs Freddy at this point, but Freddy doesn't necessarily need Jason. And so there's no way New Line is going to come to terms with lending their iconic character out unless you make some huge compromises, considering they've got a pretty solid argument that they'll be the side of the deal that's bringing in the bulk of the audience. Whatever they asked for though, Paramount were unwilling to accept their terms, or vice versa, and Freddy vs. Jason was put on ice before it even got started. This left Paramount with a problem. Without Freddy, how exactly were they going to keep the slashing saga of Jason Voorhes feeling fresh? Clearly, at least seemingly from a studio point of view, with the last film pulling in a lower box office when reviews had been better than ever, people must be getting bored of the masked man massacring the same old group of horny teens. So they needed something new, something different, something fresh to bring that bloodthirsty audience back home. That's when Daryl Haney, the film's writer, went something like, I don't know, the girl has telekinetic powers, which led producer Barbara Sachs to go, Jason versus Carrie. That's interesting. Of course, nobody was asking for Jason versus Carrie, or rather in this case, Jason versus a not as well acted or characterized stand-in for Carrie. And it's very likely this was the first time anyone said those words, followed by the statement, "That's interesting," but that didn't stop Barbara from having some incredibly lofty ambitions. According to this GQ article, Haney said that Barbara had told him she wanted this to be a different kind of Friday the 13th. She wanted it to win an Academy Award.
Okay, you big hunk of a man, come and get me!
A smidge overestimating your product, perhaps. But you know, with a producer shooting for the moon and a distinctly silly but surely bound to at least be incredibly entertaining core concept, the film had to turn out something that, if not great, was at least entertaining to watch, right? So how did it fare? The New Blood opens with a young girl, Tina, fleeing her home as her alcoholic father physically abuses her mother. She ventures out onto Crystal Lake while an apologetic father chases after her. Fraught with anger at her mother's attacker, the young Tina stares intently at her dad on the dock, and as her rage bubbles over, so does the water, as she sends an unintentional psychic shockwave in her dad's direction, one that tears down the entire dock and kills him in the process. Years later, a still traumatized Tina is now a teenager living at the same house with her mother, and is struggling to cope with her father's death, something she blames on herself. Because of this, Tina has frequent visits with an institute-provided psychiatrist called Dr. Cruz, portrayed by Terry Kisser, who is fascinated by her powers and insists he's here to help, though he often subjects her to extremely stressful situations or verbal tirades in order to incite and study her telekinesis, which Tina can't control but seems to grow stronger in emotionally heightened states. After a particularly stressful session, Tina goes to the lake where her father died, which coincidentally is also the lake one Tommy Jarvis chained a zombie Jason to the bottom of at the end of the previous movie. While staring at the lake, Tina accidentally does some psychic thing? I'm not sure exactly what the crack is here. I guess she's trying to resurrect her dad, or maybe her subconscious is. But whatever she does, it revives, or maybe just awakens Jason. I don't know. It's really hard to tell at what point Jason counts as dead or not. So either she's super incredibly powerful and literally brings him back from the afterlife, or she just has the power to wake sleeping people up, which is significantly less impressive. You're essentially an alarm clock. Give me a kazoo and a megaphone, and I could probably wake a zombie Jason up with enough time. Either way, Jason seemingly wasn't ready for this rude awakening, and he's cranky. Luckily for him, next door to Tina's family home is a group of what? Partying teens? What an unexpected turn of events for this movie series. However shall the forthcoming events unfold? If you guess Jason goes on a teen slashing murder massacre, then I guess you must be psychic too, because of course that is exactly what happens. The teens are there to have a surprise birthday party for their friend Michael, who doesn't end up showing because Jason gets to him and his girlfriend before spending the rest of the movie going through the motions of slaughtering the rest of the teens until telekinetic Tina takes the final girl role and takes him down. Besides the psychic showdown, it's very familiar territory for the franchise. Though I will say, holy shit, does Jason look good in this one. This might be the best he'll ever look. The late John Carl Buechler, who acted as director and makeup designer for this movie, watched all of the previous films and took account of every injury Jason had sustained across all 6 movies and made them part of his new look. He then, from that baseline, added all of the rot that would have occurred from being at the bottom of a lake for so long. So what we ended up with is my favourite visual incarnation of Jason ever. He has all this exposed spine and jaw and has these extremely cool details. Like when he walks, you can see in some shots exposed bone of his kneecap separating from the lower bone with each step. It's rad. I cannot undersell how fucking spectacular this makeup job is. It rules. It's easily one of the best parts of the film. And it's no surprise too, as Buechler was an extremely accomplished practical effects makeup artist before this, having worked on movies like Reanimator, Ghoulies, and rather importantly to the story of this movie, a 1987 horror film called Prison, which starred one Kane Hodder in a brief, makeup-heavy role as prisoner Charlie Forsythe, a man executed for crimes he did not commit, who rises from his grave all rotten and corpse-like near the end of the movie. Hodder's role on Prison required an incredibly intense makeup job, but not only did he not complain about the long hours in the chair when he came on as a last-minute replacement for the final scenes requiring it, he was incredibly committed to the role and would go to extra length to make Buechler's work shine as much as possible. When the director of the movie, Renny Harlin, yep, the guy who directed Nightmare 4, isn't that a fun little connection, suggested that Hodder be covered in worms when he rose from the grave, Hodder went one step further and said, "What if when I screamed, I had all these worms in my mouth to really sell how rotten the corpse had gotten?" And in a spectacular display of grossness, that's exactly what Hodder did, impressing both the director and makeup artist with his commitment to the role. So naturally, when Buechler got the job for Friday the 13th Part 7, he knew immediately who he wanted to play Jason, and brought his old colleague Hodder along for the ride, in a move that was not only welcomed by fans, as Hodder would go on to become the most beloved Jason of all time, but that also marks the only time in history where a man has landed a job by screaming at his future employer with alive worms in his mouth. Just so you know, this same strategy does not work when you apply for a position in IT. Apparently. So with an incredible makeup job and an incredible Jason, you would think that this would mean that even if the psychic stuff wasn't too great, at least the good old-fashioned Friday the 13th formula parts of the movie would be incredibly well done, right? Well, not quite. This is a shockingly tame film. I honestly cannot understand why in this day and age it even still holds an 18 certificate here in the UK. Other films have been reassessed and had their age rating lowered for new home video releases, but this still carries that big adults only sign, despite being about as bloodthirsty as an episode of Care Bears. Obviously that's speaking with a slight level of hyperbole, but for a movie in this franchise with the word blood literally in its title, there is surprisingly little red flowing in this film. The Friday the 13th films have always felt the wrath of the MPAA harder than most franchises. There isn't a single film in the entire original series that wasn't asked to make cuts that minimized its violence, but never has it come under their iron hammer harder than it did with Part 7. It is jaw-dropping just how much gore from this movie is left on the cutting room floor. Now I'm not a gorehound at all, and don't even necessarily think the over-the-top violence is this series' main appeal for me, but even I'll say that this is absolutely ridiculous. There's honestly more violence in PG-13 efforts. I'm not kidding when I say that most of this film, with a very occasional exception here and there, probably wouldn't stir much shock and surprise in a 12-year-old. I don't know why they decided to hit this entry in particular so much, but they came down hard on it. Way harder than they ever have on the franchise before. Buechler had some less than kind words for what the MPAA did to his movie in the documentary Crystal Lake Memories that I shan't be repeating for fear of the YouTube algorithm gods, but needless to say, he wasn't happy with their decisions. And can you blame him really? I mean, for God's sake. They let an on-screen actual live snake murder happen in the first film in this franchise, and in the same year, we had the body horror of Nightmare on Elm Street 4 see a woman turn into a cockroach and leave her jaw behind from her body in one of the most grotesque depictions of body horror mainstream cinema had ever seen. But God forbid a sleeping bag filled with weights pretending to be a person hit a tree more than once. Won't somebody think of the children that could be watching this? It only makes sense, right? After all, the only thing stopping little Billy, who sneaked a peek at his dad's Friday the 13th VHS collection, from becoming a completely unhinged psychopath is the choice to cut that second sleeping bag straight. An arrow through Kevin Bacon's throat though? That's just dandy. You know, I wouldn't even personally mind these cuts, at least on some level, if it didn't actually massively hinder the movie. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think art should be censored like this, but the MPAA are what they are. And they've always been a hurdle directors just kind of have to navigate around. But this is one of the few instances where their stringent censorship really negatively impacts the end work. Sure, in the past they've cut some gory moments a few frames short, and yeah, it sucks a little for the filmmakers and cast who put that effort in, but it's just something they work with, and usually after offering a few sacrificial lambs at the altar of censorship, the end film ultimately remains mostly unchanged from the artistic vision as a whole. New Blood though? Fuck man, it literally changes the movie. I'll say again, I'm by no means a big gore fan, but it must have been so frustrating for the filmmakers to get this much of their work just completely pulled from the end film. It's extremely hard to take this Jason seriously as a big, tension-building threat, no matter how good he looks and how great Hodder's performance is, when the movie sets an early precedent that all you're going to see at the end of his stalking is some quick, bloodless swipe. Add to that, sometimes the sudden cuts away from the violence have to be so abrupt to meet the MPAA standards that it can be really jarring. Shots often feel like they're unfinished or skipping, and it really takes you out of the experience. A particular egregious example occurs when the cowardly psychiatrist, a man who has been massively corrupt and put his patient's mental health at risk, who used Tina's mother as a human shield to save his own skin, who has, from the very start of the movie, been a horrendously manipulative, gaslighting villain who uses his standing in his profession to gain the trust of a vulnerable woman and then exploit her, finally meets his untimely end at the hands of our franchise killer, has his demise almost entirely wiped from the movie. I cannot stress enough that this is some bullshit. I know I keep reiterating that I'm not a huge gore fan, but the reason for this is because I need you to understand that my complaint isn't that the film is less violent. It's that it has been stripped of its artistic efforts. Regardless of your opinion on gore or the trope of using violence as a means of narrative justice, it was clear the filmmakers felt for the sake of catharsis that Dr. Cruz deserved an extremely violent fate. That narratively speaking, he had to die in a way that accurately paid off for his prior actions. And the intent to deliver on this fate was there. Before he is killed, they tease a particularly terrible end for the man, showing Jason wielding a pole chainsaw, setting up for an appropriately dramatically violent payoff. And then, they can't deliver on the promise, because the MPAA insisted they cut away. They shot loads of material for this death, but you don't get to see Dr. Cruz suffer for his sins, just a quick zip in and on to the next scene. Did I personally particularly want to see a man have his guts chainsawed out? Not really in the grand scheme of things, but the filmmakers felt it was important that this character receive a fate he deserved, and they were not allowed to do that. And while I can't ever in any way prove this, I have a hunch that they maybe would not have been asked to make such compromises in their efforts if they were making a violent crime drama, or even an action movie. There are, after all, plenty of violent, non-horror efforts of the 80s that went to cinemas without anywhere near as much censorship. I will say, the sleeping bag scene still slaps though, even with the cuts. Anyway, with the gore taking a back seat for the duration of the film and the psychic melodrama not landing with enough weight, the film plays out in a fairly dull manner, intercutting between the occasional scene of Tina struggling with her powers, or struggling to fit in with the archetypically dull teenagers whose descriptions can be summed up with single phrases, like, that one's the love interest, that one's the stoner, that one's the mean girl, etc. It's all stuff you've seen before, only now sterile and bloodless, and with the exception of a nicely tense sequence in a tool shed where Hodder gets to really show off his Jason characterization chops, getting a lot of screen time to demonstrate his deliberate manner of movement and signature heavy breathing that became synonymous with his depictions of the character, the film trots on without any real highlight, until its fairly bonkers and fun third act, which sees some Home Alone level shenanigans as Tina finally masters her powers and uses them to basically batter the living living shit out of Jason and allow Hodder to pull off some incredible stunt work, including crashing through some stairs, having an entire porch completely dropped on him with so much weight his fall here isn't faked, and perhaps most spectacular, a record-breaking fire stunt that saw the actor set ablaze for a ridiculously long 40 seconds. A shocking number by any metric, made even more surprising when you consider that at this point in his life, Hodder had almost died to a fire stunt that went incredibly wrong. When this man commits, he bloody commits. The final fight's highlights also include the reveal of Jason's incredibly gnarly rotted corpse face, which just looks so brilliantly 80s. I love it. And it all ends in a hugely spectacular explosion, the footage of which was almost completely lost when the cameras were damaged in the resulting heat. Where the fuck was this movie for the rest of the runtime? This is really fun. Even with the stripped back gore, all the crazy stunt work, the daft psychic spectacle, and the cool as fuck Jason design totally carries the third act to an entertaining series high before we close out finally on a signature element of the franchise, an incredibly confusing and nonsensical ending. This one sees Jason do his trademark final act jump scare, only for Tina's alcoholic ghost dad to sprout from the water and pull Jason under, saving the day. Man, there's so much wrong with that ending. Mainly, Tina's arc should probably have been her getting over her guilt and absolutely not have ended with her being saved by the awful abuser that burdened a young child with the trauma of carrying the responsibility of his death, when really that only came about as a result of his violent attacks on his wife. You know, narratively speaking, maybe it's a bad idea to make the alcoholic wife beater get the big damn hero moment without any prior redemption whatsoever. But hey ho, at least it's bonkers enough to be entertaining. Unfortunately, despite this wonderfully daft and chaotic third act finally delivering on this crazy original premise of Carrie versus Jason, it's all just a bit too little too late. Friday the 13th Part 7 feels like a movie at war with itself. One side of it wants to be a Friday the 13th film with telekinesis and embrace all the nonsense that comes with that. The other seems to want to be really fucking boring. It is shocking how middling and dull this entry is capable of being, considering how absolutely mental its core concept is. Some of that is to blame on MPAA censorship, and while that certainly hinders the film drastically, that's not its only fault. There's far too much of an attempt to be this heavy-handed dramatic thing. I mean, after all, the film opens on an alcoholic father loudly berating and beating his partner while their kid watches, so that's fun. But any attempt the film makes to be this kind of character drama focusing on this emotionally traumatized woman coming to grips with powers beyond her control just feels extremely ill-advised. I will give it that the melodrama side of things does give the series its first compelling non-Jason villain since Betsy Palmer showed her crazy side in Part 1 with Dr. Cruz, but as good as his performance is, it's not enough to carry it. There's just far too much going on in this one. It's like two different films at once. One an aiming to be fan-pleasing slasher flick that's unfortunately incredibly neutered by its drastic MPAA requests, and the other some kind of serious push to be a more respectable effort that falls completely flat when played side by side with scenes more in touch with the franchise's slasher roots. By all accounts, it's extremely commendable what Buechler was trying to do with this one, but the cards were just completely stacked against him. According to cast, crew, and the man himself, he approached the project initially with hesitation, wondering why you'd even want a 7th Friday film. But once he became the official man for the job, he set out with a great deal of passion, aiming to make a big crowd-pleasing stunt movie with plenty of spectacle and gory deaths. But with the MPAA breathing down his neck to pull out all of his practical effects work and a constant clash of ideas between him and executive producer Barbara Sachs, who actively disliked horror and wanted both a cheaper and more respectable product, you know, the one that wanted the movie to win an Academy Award, he was always fighting for his vision with his hands tied. Money was tight, censorship was strict, and when he wasn't being asked by the MPAA to remove a kill, his executive producer was telling him to pull things like Jason's face reveal, which, what? That's like one of the biggest highlights of the movie. Honestly though, as much as the film doesn't really land for me outside of its fun, campy, over-the-top third act, it's shocking that it came out anywhere near the level of quality that it did. It's very much a case of too many kooks, and only one of those kooks wanted to make a Friday the 13th film. But credit to Buechler, according to the cast and crew, despite being incredibly frustrated and constantly butting heads with his executive producer and the MPAA, he never once took out those frustrations on them. As they all noted, he was a pleasure to work with and have really positive things to say about the guy. Maybe if we'd gotten the untarnished vision he had in mind, we could have got an incredibly fun film in the vein of Jason Lives. But nevertheless, the film we did get, despite its flaws, still manages to scrape out some high points with its compelling secondary villain, the occasionally solid set piece, the genuinely excellent makeup effects, and the legacy-creating perfect casting of Kane Hodder, who proved to be a much beloved series mainstay for 4 whole films, becoming the only actor to have the honour of playing Jason more than once. So maybe not a great film on the whole, but certainly one with fun moments and a lasting impact on the franchise. I don't love it, but it's certainly not the worst. And seeing the small glimpses of what it was trying to be leaking through occasionally into the final product, I find it hard not to respect. And honestly, for a movie that started with nothing more than the dumb core premise of Jason versus Carrie, we could probably have gotten a lot worse. So here's to Friday the 13th Part 7, a flawed but commendable effort made with passion despite many obstacles fighting against it. And with another Friday under wraps, it's time to end today's video. But we'll be returning tomorrow and heading for the Big Apple as Jason leaves the familiar setting of Camp Crystal Lake for the big city lights of New York in Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. If you don't want to miss that, be sure to subscribe to my OnlyDans at the red button below, and don't forget to like and comment with your own thoughts. Plus, if you're really enjoying this slasher season marathon, then you can support the channel on Patreon at the link in the description and get access to some fun exclusives for your troubles. Anyway, that's all for me from today. I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 slasher season, and I will see you tomorrow.